Hello everyone and welcome to Energy Explored. This podcast covers the challenges of achieving a carbon-neutral global economy, cutting emissions of gases and pollutants and setting up new energy systems. Join Reed Smith lawyers and guest speakers as they shed light on the most important trends in emissions control and new fuels. Tune in as we follow the ever-evolving journey through the transition of energy.
Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Reed Smith's Energy Explored podcast. My name is James Wilm. I'm a partner in Dubai within our Energy and Natural Resources group. And with me today is Finlay Donaldson, who is an associate also in Dubai and sits within the E&R group. And we're going to talk today a little bit about nuclear power plant disputes and how they interact with Russian and indeed global nuclear diplomacy leaning towards sanctions. So to kick things off, Finlay, what are the main key characteristics of nuclear power plant disputes?
Thanks, James. Yeah, absolutely. So when you talk about nuclear power plant disputes, I think the first thing that always comes up is how complex they are, and they're complex in every aspect. So from the construction of the plant to the safety measures that need to be implemented, to issues surrounding licensing and regulations and also security protocol, they are incredibly complicated feats of engineering. So any dispute is going to be incredibly technical in nature. And that leads itself onto the second kind of main characteristic, which is that it tends to be an expert-driven process. So when there's a dispute arising out of a nuclear power plant, the role of experts is absolutely fundamental. It's really important to make sure you have people and experts that are familiar with the nature of the disputes, particularly, how technical they are. A lot of disputes come from issues around regulations and licensing. And often you'll require experts that were, former regulators or involved in licensing for various jurisdictions be asked to be experts within these disputes and provide their expert opinion. And another aspect of it is how high value these disputes can be. That feeds into the other aspects of it. These are, incredibly expensive projects, and naturally the disputes that arise out of it are going to be high value as well. There's also a big public interest in these kinds of disputes. Nuclear energy as a whole, can be quite controversial and is often heavily in the press and in the media. So, any disputes that arise tend to attract a certain level of public scrutiny and attention, and that's something, that parties will have to deal with. And so the final point is how strategically important these assets are. They're very linked to the government's, a government's foreign policy and energy objectives. So, any disputes that come from these projects naturally will have a certain level of government involvement.
Yeah, you're right. And as you say, there are many unique aspects and indeed issues that arise specifically to nuclear power plant disputes. And one of those is third-party liability. How does third-party liability operate specific to a nuclear power plant dispute?
Yeah, sure. So again, this is a unique element of these disputes, and essentially, when you're talking about third-party liability in the context of a nuclear power plant, the liability for nuclear damage, there is exclusive liability on the operator. And that means the liability is absolute, so it applies irrespective of fault. And there's good reason for that. The main reason for this being the liability is absolute on the operator because people in the industry were worried about there being an unreasonable burden of liability if that wasn't the case. So by establishing a very simple absolute liability on the operator, the idea is that this will avoid extensive disputes focusing specifically on who's liable for third-party nuclear damage. And this rule, as such, is actually enshrined under certain national laws and conventions. The most important being the Paris Convention on third-party liability in the field of nuclear energy, which really sets out very clearly that this is an absolute liability on the operator. And perhaps unsurprisingly, in the industry, there is often mandatory third-party liability insurance on the operator to cover it for, any cost that it's liable as a result of this. So usually this insurance is placed with national insurance pools, or alternatively with mutual insurance associations.
Yeah, I think one of the main issues that you touched upon, and again very specific to a nuclear power plant dispute, is the many and checkered security issues that arise. Did you want to explain a little bit about that? What implications security has for a power plant dispute?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is very topical at the moment because I'm sure most people are aware of what's going on in Ukraine, and particularly the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which, since March 2022 has been taken over by Russian forces. This really is incredibly important. It's the largest nuclear power plant in Ukraine. It's one of the 10 largest nuclear power plants in the world. And it really underlines the issues around security that are so unique to nuclear power plants. There's a long history of security issues surrounding these plants. A lot of this has been more from the cyber attack aspect of it rather than what we're seeing in Zaporizhzhia. But really, given the fundamental importance of nuclear material, this comes with incredibly stringent and regulated safety measures to protect against these risks. So one of the main things that the safety measures trying to stop is the theft of nuclear material, which may end up in the hands of bad actors, as we call them. A kind of added element of it is that security of nuclear power plants is often left to a government level, so it's not always private. So you have government intervention and certain authorities and requirements that come straight from the government. And I guess a lot of the information is classified, for fear of, again, ending up in the wrong hands. So, there's issues with dealing with classified information, and that really, those specific elements really lead to the kind of complexities we were talking about earlier. And I guess if you wanted to apply it, specifically to a dispute and an arbitration, there are a myriad of potential issues that you would have to deal with. I guess the first one would be if you were to, obtain witness or expert evidence on certain issues, you would have to be very, very careful that evidence does not contain classified information, that might threaten the security of a state or otherwise. You would need to be very clear that information can be disclosed within an arbitration or other dispute proceedings. From a disclosure perspective, again, there would be huge issues around confidentiality of information. If you're making disclosure requests, it's going to be a complicated process to work out what is classified, what is confidential, what can be disclosed. And again, that would require a fair amount of government input there as well. I guess one thing that parties would need to agree on is a procedure for how the confidential information would be treated throughout the course of a dispute. That's normally dealt with at a kind of terms of reference stage, but I think that is an issue that would have to have an exceptional amount of thought and discussion between the parties as to a process that both parties would be comfortable with throughout the duration of the dispute. Another issue is relating to the nationality of the parties and the individuals involved. If you have certain parties from nationalities and jurisdictions that aren't particularly warm to each other, there may be issues with disclosing information to certain nationalities, and you may be in a situation where you have to set up a Chinese wall style process where certain information is not provided to certain parties or individuals or experts for national security reasons.
No, you're completely right there, Finn. Moving away perhaps from technicalities of the disputes themselves, there's clearly a lot of politics involved in nuclear energy and specifically in relation to Russia. And that's obviously something that we've both been focused on within this particular year. And as you know, it's hard to cut that dependency on the Russian energy sector, not least the Russian nuclear sector. So you've got the political issue right now where Europe and to a lesser extent the UK have been weaning themselves off Russian fossil fuels in the last 18 months, primarily because of the sanctions restrictions. But you're still left with a significant connection between Europe and the Russian nuclear sector, and there's many reasons for that. It's pretty straightforward relatively to change your source of fossil fuels. You can reroute coal. You can obviously reroute crude products on the water. Gas slightly more complicated, but LNG is also a more movable product. Nuclear is clearly not the same. Europe is generally very dependent on Russian uranium as a power source for its nuclear stations, and indeed from Ukraine, both of which are impacted for the same reasons in the sense of driven by the conflict. And also technology. So many of the power plants already in force in the EU and operational, or indeed power plants that are coming online, have a significant dependency on Russian nuclear technology and services, notwithstanding the fuel elements themselves, which probably explains why Rosatom, the Russian state-owned nuclear power company, is, as of today, untouched by global sanctions because it's simply not as straightforward as swapping that technology, the services, or even uranium to a non-Russian party.
No, that's very true, James. And I guess that's the kind of short-term outlook. I guess if we're looking at the longer term picture, in what ways can the EU reduce its dependency on the Russian nuclear sector and moving forward? Obviously, this isn't a straightforward, matter for the reasons you've spoken about. But are there ways that they can, slowly reduce their dependency on Russian nuclear, the sector?
Yeah, I think slow is the key. Slow and gradual. As I said, a switch in source and services is just not an overnight exercise. We are really talking years here, and a lot of cost. Hungary got some major nuclear infrastructure projects that are in JVs with the Russian nuclear power plant sector, and you just can't restart that again overnight. I kind of think it has to happen more from a stability reason, from a security reasons. I don't see a world whereby, certainly if the current Russian regime stays in force, that the Western powers will allow pockets of Russian influence, let's say, within the European nuclear sector. I just don't see politically that will be allowed. But this is going to take some time. But it will happen, and it'll happen by advances in technology, engineers and being retrained, engineers being uptrained to manage the transition, and obviously different sources of fundamental fuel supply away from Russian uranium will need to be identified. And to be honest, the Ukraine itself is a large source of uranium. So in a world where the conflict is over in some shape or form, that's an obvious source of fuel supply for the reactors within Europe. But we are really talking, I think, years as opposed to months for this particular transition.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess one point I had on that is how relevant this is at the moment. I think we've seen this week discussions between the UK and Russia about certain weapons that the UK are proposing to send that I think Russia have perhaps falsely said may contain uranium, or certainly there's a debate about the nuclear aspects of that. And I think the last year has shown that Russia's been willing to weaponize nuclear materials, for want of a better phrase, and that feeds into the need for the EU and other nations to try and reduce its dependency on Russia from mainly safety reasons, really.
Yeah, completely agree. And that's probably all we've got time for today. So thank you very much for listening in to Finlay and I. I hope that was useful. No doubt further topics of relevant will be explored in future Energy Explored podcasts. But thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Energy Explored is a Reed Smith production. Our producer is Ali McCardle. For more information about Reed Smith's energy and natural resources practice, please email energyexplored@reedsmith.com. You can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and reedsmith.com, and our social media accounts at Reed Smith LLP on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. This podcast is provided for educational purposes. It does not constitute legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship, nor is it intended to suggest or establish standards of care applicable to particular lawyers in any given situation. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Any views, opinions, or comments made by any external guest speaker are not to be attributed to Reed Smith LLP or its individual lawyers. All rights reserved.